There's a kind of pain that almost nobody knows how to explain properly, the kind that lives in the middle, not fully rejected, but never fully chosen either. The kind where someone looks at you with warmth, opens up to you in moments that feel deeply real, gives you emotional intimacy that feels impossible to fake, and yet somehow still keeps you standing outside the door of the relationship you secretly wish existed. And what makes this pain even harder is that it doesn't look toxic from the outside. There are no dramatic endings, no explosive betrayals, no clear answers, just confusion, mixed signals, emotional closeness followed by distance, moments that feel intensely personal, followed by silence that makes you question whether any of it meant what you thought it did. And when the person you're dealing with has avoidant tendencies, that confusion becomes even more emotionally exhausting. Avoidants often create a connection that feels deeper than friendship, while simultaneously resisting the vulnerability required for a real relationship. They pull close, then disappear. They give affection, then suddenly become cold. They make you feel emotionally seen in ways nobody else has, while still keeping part of themselves emotionally far away. Slowly, without realizing it, you can end up trapped in a painful emotional position where you're constantly hoping the connection will finally become something more, hoping that if you say the right thing, love them correctly, stay patient long enough, or prove your loyalty deeply enough, eventually they'll stop resisting what's obviously there between you. But the truth is, the harder you try to escape the friend zone with an avoidant by chasing the relationship, the deeper you often fall into the exact dynamic that keeps you stuck there. Because this is not just about attraction, it's about emotional safety. And most people completely misunderstand what emotional safety means to someone who fears intimacy. Avoidants often want connection just as deeply as anyone else, sometimes even more deeply. But connection activates fear inside them at the same time. Fear of losing control, fear of depending on someone emotionally, fear of vulnerability, fear of being trapped, fear of disappointing someone, fear of eventually getting hurt. So what happens is they unconsciously create distance even when genuine feelings exist, especially when genuine feelings exist. That's why you can feel them caring about you while still watching them resist getting closer. And this creates one of the most emotionally confusing experiences a person can go through, because your heart keeps picking up signals that something real exists beneath the surface. You notice the emotional intimacy, the lingering conversations, the way they act differently around you compared to everyone else, the moments where they almost let their walls down completely. Every one of those moments gives you hope, hope that maybe the relationship is slowly evolving into something deeper. But then, just as things start feeling emotionally close, they pull away again. Suddenly you're left replaying everything in your mind, trying to understand what changed. What most people never realize is that avoidants often feel safest in emotionally undefined connections. Connections where they can experience closeness without fully surrendering to the responsibilities and vulnerability of commitment. That emotional gray area allows them to feel attached while still maintaining psychological distance. And if you become too emotionally available too quickly, too focused on securing the relationship, or too emotionally dependent on their validation, it can unintentionally activate their fear system even more. Not because you're too much, but because emotional pressure feels overwhelming to someone who associates intimacy with losing emotional freedom. And this is where so many people accidentally lose themselves. Because once you feel emotionally attached to an avoidant, you start trying harder to prove your value. You become more understanding, more patient, more emotionally available. You tolerate inconsistency because you keep focusing on the version of them you see underneath the fear. You excuse the distance because you know they've been hurt. You stay emotionally loyal even while receiving uncertainty in return. Over time, your emotional world slowly begins revolving around whether they're moving closer or pulling away. You begin measuring your worth by their emotional availability. And that's the moment the dynamic quietly becomes unbalanced. Because the more emotionally focused you become on winning the relationship, the less emotionally grounded you become within yourself. And strangely, that shift is exactly what avoidants feel, even when they can't explain it consciously. Avoidants are incredibly sensitive to emotional pressure beneath the surface. They notice when someone's emotional stability starts depending on them. They feel the weight of expectation even when it's unspoken. Once that happens, the connection can begin feeling emotionally heavy to them instead of emotionally safe. That's why chasing clarity often creates more confusion. The more you try to force certainty, the more they instinctively create space. And this is the part nobody wants to hear. You cannot convince an avoidant to emotionally choose you through overgiving, overloving, over-explaining, or over-sacrificing yourself. You cannot earn emotional safety by abandoning your own emotional center. In fact, the more you emotionally overextend yourself trying to secure the relationship, the more the connection often shifts into an unconscious imbalance, where they hold the emotional power and you hold the emotional anxiety. Eventually, without realizing it, you stop showing up as someone they could genuinely build emotional attraction toward and start showing up as someone desperately trying not to lose them. That energy changes everything. Attraction is deeply connected to emotional polarity. And when one person becomes emotionally consumed by the connection while the other remains uncertain, the relationship starts operating from imbalance instead of mutual emotional investment. This is why so many people remain trapped in the friend zone with avoidance for months, sometimes years, not because they aren't valuable, not because they aren't lovable, but because their fear of losing the connection slowly causes them to abandon the very emotional groundedness that originally made the connection feel attractive in the first place. The painful part is that most people don't even notice it happening. It happens quietly through overthinking every text, waiting for replies that determine your mood, constantly trying to decode emotional signals, feeling temporary relief whenever they move closer again, then emotional panic whenever they pull away. It becomes an emotional cycle built around uncertainty, and uncertainty is addictive, especially when emotional validation arrives inconsistently. The human nervous system starts craving moments of closeness even more intensely after periods of emotional distance. Every small sign of affection suddenly feels enormous. Every vulnerable conversation feels like proof that the relationship is finally progressing. Every moment of intimacy becomes emotionally amplified because you've spent so much time deprived of stability. That emotional roller coaster creates attachment that feels incredibly hard to break away from. But here's where the real shift begins. The moment you stop trying to force the relationship and start reclaiming yourself emotionally, everything changes. Not because you're playing games, not because you're manipulating them, but because emotionally grounded energy feels radically different to avoidance than anxious pursuit does. When you stop chasing reassurance, stop trying to prove your worth, and stop making them the center of your emotional world, the dynamic quietly begins changing beneath the surface. For the first time, your energy no longer feels emotionally demanding. Ironically, that's often when avoidants finally start feeling the emotional weight of your absence. Avoidants are accustomed to managing closeness by creating distance, but when the other person finally stops emotionally chasing them, something unexpected happens internally. The nervous system that once focused entirely on maintaining space suddenly has room to feel attachment more clearly. Your absence becomes emotionally noticeable in a different way. The emotional certainty they once assumed would always be there suddenly becomes uncertain. And uncertainty affects avoidance too, deeply. More deeply than they usually admit, especially when the connection genuinely mattered to them. Underneath avoidance is often a person who learned that closeness eventually leads to pain, pressure, disappointment, or loss of self, so they protect themselves by controlling emotional distance. But when someone calmly stops overextending toward them, stops emotionally gripping the relationship, and stops revolving their identity around being chosen, it interrupts the entire dynamic. For the first time, they're no longer reacting to your pursuit, they're confronting their own feelings instead. And this is the part that changes everything. Escaping the friend zone with an avoidant is rarely about forcing them to see your value. It's about becoming emotionally grounded enough that you no longer need to beg for it. Because emotional security is magnetic, not loud confidence, not pretending not to care, not toxic detachment, real emotional groundedness. The kind where your peace no longer depends on whether someone chooses you. The kind where you can love deeply without abandoning yourself. The kind where your self-worth remains intact, even when someone is emotionally inconsistent. Avoidants feel that difference immediately because most people approach them with emotional urgency, while very few approach them with calm emotional stability. The moment you stop trying to emotionally force outcomes, you begin showing up differently. Your conversations change, your energy changes, your reactions change. You stop trying to pull commitment out of someone emotionally unavailable and start observing whether their actions genuinely align with the kind of relationship you deserve. That shift creates clarity, not only for them but for you. Because somewhere along the way, many people become so focused on escaping the friend zone that they stop asking a deeper question entirely. Is this connection actually giving me the emotional safety I keep trying to give them? And sometimes that realization becomes the beginning of your real transformation. Not the transformation where you finally win the avoidant, but the transformation where you stop losing yourself inside emotionally uncertain love. And strangely enough, that is often the exact moment the entire dynamic begins changing in ways neither of you expected. And the deeper you begin understanding this, the more you realize something that changes the entire way you approach the connection. You were never supposed to convince someone to choose you. Real love does not begin with persuasion. It begins with emotional willingness. One of the most painful traps people fall into with avoidance is believing that if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, love deeply enough, or stay patient long enough, eventually the avoidant will finally feel safe enough to fully open their heart. So they keep trying to say the perfect thing, trying to avoid conflict, trying not to trigger distance, trying to become easy to love. But slowly, without noticing it, their entire emotional world becomes organized around managing another person's fears instead of honoring their own emotional needs. That imbalance becomes exhausting because no matter how much effort you give, you still end up feeling emotionally uncertain most of the time. One day the connection feels warm, intimate, almost undeniable. The next day it feels distant, cold, emotionally unreachable. Your nervous system starts living inside those fluctuations. You begin craving reassurance, like emotional oxygen, not because you're weak, but because inconsistency creates emotional instability in even the strongest people when it continues long enough, especially when genuine feelings are involved. Avoidants often don't realize how deeply their inconsistency affects the people attached to them. From the outside, they may seem calm, detached, or emotionally controlled, but internally, many avoidants carry enormous fear around vulnerability and closeness. So instead of moving steadily toward intimacy, they move in cycles, close, then distant, vulnerable, then withdrawn, emotionally present, then suddenly unavailable. And if you're emotionally attached to them, those shifts can feel devastating because every time they pull away, it feels personal. You wonder if you said too much, wanted too much, or needed too much. You start shrinking parts of yourself to avoid losing the connection. Eventually, you stop showing up naturally altogether. You become hyper-aware, careful, emotionally cautious, always trying to maintain closeness without scaring them away. But love was never supposed to feel like emotional survival. The moment you finally understand that, something powerful begins shifting inside you. Because escaping the friend zone with an avoidant is not about learning how to emotionally chase them more effectively. It's about learning how to stop abandoning yourself emotionally in the process of loving them. That's the real turning point. The moment where your energy stops saying, "Please choose me," and starts saying, "I care about you deeply, but I will not lose myself trying to earn basic emotional consistency." That energy changes everything. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to emotional dependency beneath the surface. Even when they crave closeness, they often become overwhelmed when they feel someone emotionally gripping them for security, certainty, or validation. It activates pressure internally, even if you never intended to create pressure at all. This is why emotional groundedness becomes so powerful. Not emotional coldness, not pretending not to care, real groundedness. The kind where your emotional stability no longer rises and falls entirely based on someone else's availability. The kind where you can tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into panic. The kind where your self-worth remains intact even when someone is inconsistent. Emotionally secure energy feels calm. It doesn't chase. It doesn't beg. It doesn't over-explain its value. And for avoidance, calm emotional energy often feels far safer than emotional intensity ever could. That's why one of the biggest shifts happens the moment you stop trying to convince them to see your worth. Because the harder you try to prove your value, the more invisible your value often becomes. Not because you lack worth, but because over-pursuit changes the emotional dynamic. It unconsciously communicates, "I need your choice in order to feel okay." Once that energy settles into the connection, attraction often weakens beneath the surface because the relationship stops feeling emotionally balanced. One person is chasing reassurance while the other is trying to escape pressure, and both people end up emotionally exhausted. But when you finally pull your emotional energy back inward, not as punishment or manipulation, but as self-respect, the entire emotional atmosphere changes. Suddenly you stop monitoring every interaction. You stop trying to decode every text. You stop overextending emotionally for tiny moments of validation. Instead, you begin reconnecting with your own emotional center again, your own peace, your own life, your own identity outside the relationship. Strangely, that's often when avoidance begins seeing you differently. Emotional independence creates space, and space allows attraction to breathe again. Many avoidants are used to people emotionally chasing them once attachment forms. They're used to feeling responsible for another person's emotional expectations. But when someone remains emotionally calm, grounded and connected to themselves instead of obsessively pursuing reassurance, it disrupts the pattern they unconsciously expect. You no longer feel emotionally heavy, you feel emotionally safe. And emotional safety is incredibly powerful to someone who fears intimacy. Not because it guarantees they'll suddenly transform overnight, but because it removes the invisible pressure that often keeps their defenses activated. This is where many people misunderstand what pulling your energy back actually means. It does not mean becoming cruel. It does not mean playing manipulative games. It does not mean pretending you don't care. Real detachment is quieter than that. It's the moment you stop trying to control the outcome, the moment you stop forcing closeness, the moment you stop making someone else responsible for your emotional stability. When that shift happens genuinely, avoidants often feel it immediately, because your energy no longer feels emotionally grasping. It feels peaceful, and peace creates curiosity. Suddenly they notice your absence more deeply. Your silence feels different. Your emotional availability no longer feels guaranteed. Underneath their distance, many avoidants begin feeling something they were too emotionally distracted to feel before: loss. Not always dramatic loss, not immediate panic, but quiet emotional awareness, the awareness that your presence mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. Here's the truth most people never hear. Avoidants often suppress attachment feelings while the connection feels emotionally accessible and guaranteed. But once emotional certainty disappears, those feelings can rise to the surface much more intensely. That's why avoidants sometimes seem emotionally unaffected during closeness, but deeply impacted once distance becomes real. Without pressure clouding the connection, they finally have room to feel their own attachment. This is where everything begins changing internally for both people. For the first time, you stop relating to the connection from fear. You stop trying to win love. You stop treating your worth like something another person must validate before you can believe in it yourself. Instead, you begin embodying something avoidants rarely encounter consistently: emotional stability. Not perfection, not emotional suppression. Stability. The ability to remain emotionally connected to yourself even inside uncertainty. That kind of energy is unforgettable because most people react emotionally when avoidants create distance. They chase harder, panic harder, cling harder. But emotionally grounded people respond differently. They notice the inconsistency without abandoning themselves emotionally to fix it. They allow space without collapsing internally. They maintain warmth without sacrificing boundaries. That balance changes the entire emotional dynamic. Avoidants often test emotional safety unconsciously, not through malicious intent, but through patterns: delayed responses, inconsistency, pulling away after intimacy, creating ambiguity, acting close one moment and distant the next. Beneath all of it is often one unconscious question: if I create distance, will you emotionally explode, pressure me, guilt me, or lose yourself trying to hold on to me? Many avoidants learned early in life that closeness came with emotional overwhelm, so they become highly sensitive to emotional reactions from others. When someone responds to distance with panic, pressure, or emotional pursuit, it reinforces their internal fear that intimacy will eventually consume their freedom or emotional peace. But emotionally secure people respond differently, not coldly, not vindictively. They don't chase emotional inconsistency endlessly. They don't beg for crumbs of affection. They don't overfunction for the relationship while the other person underfunctions emotionally. And that response feels unfamiliar to avoidance in a powerful way, because calm boundaries communicate self-respect, and self-respect changes attraction. The moment you stop tolerating half-love as though it's all you deserve, your energy changes completely. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop mistaking emotional unavailability for depth. You stop seeing potential as the same thing as reality. For many people, that realization becomes heartbreaking at first because it forces you to confront how much hope you placed into who someone could become emotionally, instead of honestly looking at who they consistently are. But it also becomes freeing because now you're no longer trapped inside emotional waiting for clarity, waiting for consistency, waiting for someone to finally become emotionally available enough to love you properly. Instead, you begin asking a healthier question: does this connection actually nourish me emotionally, or am I surviving on occasional moments of closeness while constantly starving for stability? That question changes everything, because the real danger of the friend zone with an avoidant is not simply that they won't commit. It's that you can slowly become emotionally addicted to potential while neglecting your own emotional needs entirely. Over time, that creates profound emotional exhaustion. You start feeling anxious more than peaceful, confused more than secure, hopeful more than fulfilled. The longer that imbalance continues, the more disconnected you become from yourself, until eventually you don't even recognize the emotionally grounded version of yourself anymore. But healing begins the moment you stop treating emotional inconsistency as proof you need to love harder and start recognizing it as information. Information about where the other person is emotionally, information about what they are currently capable of giving, information about whether the connection is truly reciprocal or whether you've been carrying the emotional weight of the relationship mostly alone. That awareness can feel painful, but it also becomes the beginning of your freedom, because once you stop chasing emotionally unavailable love, you finally create space for something else to emerge: peace, clarity, and self-respect. And sometimes, unexpectedly, that's the exact moment the avoidant finally begins realizing what they're truly at risk of losing. And when that realization finally begins settling inside them, it rarely happens in the dramatic way people imagine. Most avoidants do not suddenly wake up one morning overwhelmed by emotion, ready to confess everything they feel. For many of them, it happens quietly, slowly, in silence, because the moment you stop emotionally chasing them, the connection starts feeling different in a way they cannot easily ignore anymore. Your absence becomes noticeable, not only physically but emotionally. The energy they once felt constantly reaching toward them suddenly becomes still. The emotional reassurance they unconsciously depended on is no longer surrounding them in the same way. For the first time, they are left alone with their own emotional experience instead of reacting to yours. That's when many avoidants begin seeing you differently. Not because you manipulated them, not because you played hard to get, but because your emotional energy changed from pursuit to self-possession. There is something incredibly powerful about a person who stops abandoning themselves for love. When you are constantly available emotionally, constantly overextending, constantly trying to prove your loyalty and patience, the connection often loses emotional tension. The avoidant unconsciously becomes accustomed to your presence, always being there, no matter how inconsistently they show up. But when your energy shifts inward, when your attention returns to your own life, when your happiness no longer revolves around whether they text, pull close, or withdraw, something changes in the emotional atmosphere between you. You become harder to emotionally predict, and unpredictability creates reflection. Suddenly, they can no longer assume your emotional devotion is permanent. That uncertainty forces them to confront feelings they may have been avoiding for a very long time. Avoidants often suppress emotional attachment while they still feel in control of the distance. As long as they believe the connection remains available whenever they are ready for it, they can continue managing closeness without fully confronting their deeper emotions. But the moment your energy genuinely begins moving away from them emotionally, the nervous system often reacts differently. Not always outwardly, not always immediately, but internally, because now there is something real to lose, and loss has a way of breaking through emotional avoidance in ways closeness sometimes cannot. That's why so many avoidants suddenly become more emotionally attentive once the other person truly begins detaching. They start reaching out more. They become more curious, more emotionally aware, sometimes even unexpectedly vulnerable. For the person who spent so long waiting for this shift, it can feel incredibly validating. Finally, they're noticing. Finally, they're showing effort. Finally, it feels like maybe the connection is becoming what you hoped it could be all along. But this is where emotional clarity becomes essential, because attention is not always transformation. Temporary fear of loss is not always the same thing as emotional readiness. This is why so many people get pulled back into the exact same cycle after finally beginning to heal. The avoidant senses emotional distance, moves closer again, and anxious attachment immediately reactivates hope. Suddenly, all the old feelings rush back to the surface. The closeness feels intoxicating because you missed them so deeply. Before you know it, you're emotionally reinvesting fully into the connection again without noticing whether anything has actually changed beneath the surface. But real change is not measured by temporary closeness. It's measured by consistency. Consistency during vulnerability. Consistency during emotional intimacy. Consistency after conflict. Consistency when things become emotionally real. Avoidants are often capable of moments of deep connection. The problem is not always emotional depth. The problem is sustaining emotional openness once vulnerability activates fear again. This is why your boundaries matter more now than ever before. Not walls, not punishment, boundaries. Healthy emotional standards that protect your peace instead of sacrificing it for temporary closeness. The truth is that many people spend so long trying to get out of the friend zone that they forget to ask whether the relationship dynamic itself is emotionally healthy enough to sustain long-term. They become so focused on finally being chosen that they stop paying attention to how emotionally unstable the connection has been making them feel. Love should not require the constant abandonment of your nervous system. It should not require you to shrink your needs into silence just to maintain connection. It should not leave you constantly questioning where you stand. Yes, relationships require patience. Yes, avoidance often carry deep emotional wounds, but your empathy for someone's pain should never require you to betray your own emotional well-being in return. That realization becomes one of the most important turning points in this entire journey. For the first time, you stop seeing boundaries as something that pushes love away and start seeing them as the very thing that protects healthy love from becoming emotionally destructive. Strangely, avoidants often respect boundaries more than emotional pursuit because boundaries feel emotionally clear, predictable, and safe. They remove the emotional chaos that pressure creates. When you calmly communicate what you will and will not accept without anger, emotional manipulation, or desperation, something shifts in the connection. You stop appearing emotionally dependent and start appearing emotionally grounded. That difference matters enormously because grounded people do not tolerate endless ambiguity. They do not endlessly chase someone who keeps giving mixed signals. They do not sacrifice their emotional health trying to rescue someone from intimacy fears. They can love deeply while still protecting themselves. That emotional balance becomes magnetic, not because it's performative, but because it's real. For perhaps the first time in a long time, you are no longer relating to the connection from fear of losing them. You are relating to it from respect for yourself. That changes your behavior in subtle but powerful ways. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to force emotional conversations before the other person is capable of having them maturely. You stop interpreting every small sign of affection as proof that permanent change has happened. Instead, you begin observing calmly, watching actions, watching consistency, watching whether emotional effort continues once the fear of losing you settles down again. Because one of the hardest truths about avoidance is this: sometimes they come closer, not because they are finally ready for love, but because distance activated their attachment wounds too. If you do not recognize that difference, you can become trapped in endless emotional cycles where moments of closeness repeatedly reignite hope without ever creating true stability. That cycle can last for years. People lose themselves inside it. They wait, hope, overanalyze, forgive an inconsistency repeatedly. Every time the avoidant comes back emotionally, they interpret it as proof that the relationship is finally evolving. But love cannot survive on emotional breadcrumbs forever. Eventually, something inside you becomes exhausted. Not because you stopped loving them, but because your nervous system can no longer survive the instability. This is where one of the deepest emotional awakenings begins. You realize that escaping the friend zone is not actually the ultimate goal anymore. Peace is, emotional safety is, reciprocity is, consistency is. After enough emotional confusion, your soul stops craving intensity and starts craving stability instead. You stop wanting to feel almost loved. You stop wanting potential. You stop wanting temporary moments of intimacy, followed by emotional disappearance. You begin wanting something calmer, safer, and more emotionally honest. That shift changes the entire way you approach the connection. Now when the avoidant comes closer, you no longer immediately surrender your entire emotional world again. You remain present but observant, open but grounded, caring but self-respecting. For avoidance, that kind of emotional energy often feels profoundly different because most people either chase them anxiously or shut down completely. Very few people remain emotionally warm while still maintaining healthy boundaries. Very few people refuse to participate in emotional chaos without becoming cruel themselves. That balance creates something avoidants secretly long for, beneath all the fear: safety without control, connection without pressure, and love without emotional engulfment. But even then, real transformation still requires something difficult from them: accountability. No matter how deep their wounds are or how strong their fears may be, sustainable relationships still require emotional responsibility. They still require communication, effort, consistency, vulnerability, and the willingness to remain emotionally present even when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. This is where many avoidants struggle the most, because emotional closeness eventually activates old survival patterns again: the urge to withdraw, to numb out, to regain emotional control through distance, to avoid vulnerability before vulnerability creates fear. Unless they consciously work on those patterns, the cycle eventually repeats itself no matter how strong the connection feels. That's why boundaries become essential, not to punish them, but to protect yourself from disappearing emotionally inside someone else's unresolved fears. You cannot heal another person by sacrificing your own emotional health. This realization can feel heartbreaking when you genuinely love someone deeply, especially when you know their distance comes from fear rather than lack of care. But emotional understanding alone does not create healthy relationships. Mutual emotional effort does. This is the point where many people finally stop romanticizing suffering in love. They stop believing that enduring endless confusion proves the depth of their loyalty. They stop measuring love by how much pain they can tolerate. Instead, they begin understanding something much healthier. Real love should feel emotionally safe enough that you do not constantly have to fight for basic reassurance. Once you truly understand that, you stop accepting half-love disguised as emotional complexity. You stop clinging to tiny moments of affection while ignoring long periods of inconsistency. You stop betraying your own needs just because someone else is afraid of intimacy. That shift changes your entire presence, because now your energy no longer says, "I'll wait forever hoping you finally choose me." Now it says, "I care deeply about you, but I also care deeply about myself." And that energy changes everything. And the moment your energy begins carrying that message, something quietly shifts inside you, not dramatically, but deeply. Your focus slowly moves away from trying to secure love from someone else and returns back to yourself. Your peace, your stability, the parts of you that got lost in emotional uncertainty. This is where real letting go begins, not in anger, not in denial, and not by forcing yourself to stop caring. It begins when you stop fighting reality, when you stop trying to turn potential into permanence, when you stop draining yourself trying to pull consistency out of someone who still fears intimacy more than they choose emotional stability. And strangely, this shift is often felt on the other side more than expected, not because you are doing anything manipulative, but because your energy is no longer chasing. Avoidants are used to emotional pursuit returning again and again, but when it doesn't, the emotional certainty they relied on starts to fade. Your absence becomes noticeable in a different way, not loud, but real. That's when internal conflict can begin for them. Part of them feels distance and wants to reconnect. Part of them still fears closeness. Part of them suddenly misses your presence more than they admitted before. And this inner tension can sometimes bring them back with unexpected emotional intensity. More attention, more warmth, more effort than before. And this is where clarity becomes essential, because intensity is not the same as change. Fear of loss can create emotional urgency, but it doesn't automatically create emotional stability. Real connection requires consistency, communication, and the ability to stay emotionally present, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. So if they return, the most important shift is not going back to the old dynamic, the old pattern of you overgiving, them withdrawing, you chasing clarity, them avoiding emotional responsibility cannot become healthy just because emotions briefly intensified. Something deeper has to change, starting with you. You begin holding yourself differently, not with anger, but with standards. You stop accepting inconsistency as complexity. You stop confusing mixed signals with depth. You stop romanticizing emotional unavailability just because the connection feels strong. Instead, you start asking a more honest question. Can this person actually show up consistently when things become real? Because real love is not built on chemistry alone. It is built on emotional safety. And emotional safety cannot survive constant inconsistency. This is where many people finally realize they were not just attached to a person, but to potential. They were tolerating confusion, waiting for clarity, and shrinking themselves emotionally in hopes of finally being chosen. But healing begins when you understand your worth was never dependent on someone else's readiness to love you properly. And that realization changes everything. You stop asking how to make them choose you and start asking why you were willing to accept so little for so long. That question brings awareness, even if it's painful at first, because it forces you to see how much anxiety you normalized and how often you abandoned yourself just to maintain connection. But it also brings freedom, because now you begin valuing something different: consistency, peace, reciprocity. You stop chasing emotional highs followed by silence. You stop equating anxiety with love. You start recognizing what emotional safety actually feels like: steady presence, mutual effort, and calm connection. And once you experience even a glimpse of that, you can't fully go back to relationships built on instability. Because you finally understand the truth. Escaping the friend zone was never about getting someone to choose you. It was about finally choosing yourself. Choosing peace over chaos, choosing self-respect over emotional crumbs, choosing emotional stability over endless waiting. And from that place, whether the connection continues or ends, you don't lose yourself in it anymore. Because real love should never require you to abandon yourself just to keep someone else close.